The figure of the witch can be found around the world and through various points throughout history. And today I just wanted to share 5 myths that may be living in our imagination due to the way that pop culture often portrays witches, and specifically historical witches and the witch trials. So, the figure of the witch is far more nuanced than is often portrayed, especially in really popular culture and even online sometimes. And this, I feel, is especially true when we're looking at the witchcraft trials of Europe. And I wanted to focus in on some of the myths that have to do with the historical witches. And really, I decided that to do this, it was best to really tune into one space. So I'm looking at Western Europe and even more specifically England, because the story of the witch throughout the world, throughout history, and even just looking regionally in England is very nuanced and different depending on where you go. So let's start with these first myths. Actually, before we start with the myths, just a simple definition to always keep in mind. When we are looking at the historical witch in Europe, what we're talking about is a figure who was believed to do harmful magic. Magic that was meant to harm the community or to harm specific individuals. Historically, there was no good witch figure because the witch figure specifically did harmful magic. Those who did helpful protective magic were not seen to be witches. Of course, these lines would sometimes blur, and those who were at first believed to do protective and useful magic, well, you can imagine, maybe it didn't work, and then sometimes they would get blamed for harmful magic. I just still think it's important, though, to keep in our minds that historically speaking, witches are specifically looked at doing harmful magic. Myth number 1, witches were always burned at the stake. In England, witches were not burned at the stake, they were actually hung, and that is because witchcraft was a felony charge. Interesting side note though, in Scotland, witches' bodies were burned, but this was after they were strangled first. Myth number 2. If you were accused of witchcraft, it was nearly impossible to prove your innocence. In England, for example, this definitely is not the case. When you were accused of witchcraft, it actually became rather bureaucratic, the whole process, and you were put on trial. And according to the records at this time, it was close to about 25% of those who were accused of witchcraft were actually found to be guilty of witchcraft. The next myth is that the witchcraft trials in Europe are to be entirely blamed on the Spanish Inquisition and the Roman Catholic Church. In reality, all of the major Christian denominations in Western Europe were involved in witchcraft trials, and that those are Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and when you're looking specifically at England and Scotland, these were Protestant states that were bringing witchcraft trials to the court. Tied to this myth is also just that it's important to understand that the Spanish Inquisition was focused on seeking out heretics and heresy. So it was focused on those who weren't worshiping in the proper Christian way. During the Spanish Inquisition, witchcraft was actually more just seen as a superstition and not a heresy per se. And it was very, very rare, very, very rare for someone to be accused of witchcraft because, again, they were focused in on heretics. I find this very interesting, and am seeing that when you really look historically at the witchcraft trials in Europe, some of our popular beliefs and some of what's happening is that what was happening to seek out heretics is mixed in with those who were accused of witchcraft. And when we learn these things, we just get a deeper and more nuanced picture of what was happening historically. There's many who believe and have shared that those who were accused of witchcraft were almost entirely women. And this isn't true in Western Europe. When you look at it, there were also a lot of men who were accused and found guilty of witchcraft. Now, overall, from the records and what we know is that the majority were women, but still there were very many men who were accused and found guilty of witchcraft. And it actually, again, depended regionally. In some Scandinavian countries, there were far more men who were accused of witchcraft than there were women. Witches were mostly herbalists and midwives in their communities. This is another popular myth. In reality, there were all kinds of people who were accused of witchcraft. And when you look at the records that do survive, specifically we're talking about England again, there were some midwives or herbalists who may have been in the mix, but in no way were they the majority or specifically targeted for witchcraft accusations. Actually, what often happened is that midwives were employed to help build a case against a witch, and that's because they would perform very intimate investigations of someone's body to see if they could find witch marks on the body to thus prove the guilt of the witch. So those were just 5 myths of a very specific place and time when looking at the figure of the witch. And I just thought it was important to share this video because we want to remember that when looking at the history and the figure of the witch, it's far more nuanced than it is often portrayed to be in popular culture. Thanks so much for spending time with Gently Being.